This year, we celebrate the 150th anniversary of the Morrill Act. This act was signed by President Lincoln in 1862 to create the means for states to establish universities for study of agriculture and mechanical arts, in addition to traditional studies. Dr. John Owens, former Harlan Vice Chancellor of the University of Nebraska-Lincoln Institute of Agriculture and Natural Resources, and Dr. Dick Fleming, former Administrator and Professor Emeritus in UNL's Department of Agriculture Leadership, Education, and Communications, both have a passion for the Act of 1862 and discuss the importance of the Act to Nebraska.
Sure. I am John Owens, and I came here in December of 2000 to serve as the Vice President and Vice Chancellor for Agriculture and Natural Resources. I am an entomologist by scientific endeavor, and I served at New Mexico State University before I came to Nebraska, first as a faculty member and then as a department head, and then many years as Dean of Agriculture and Home Economics. And I spent my last 4 years or so as Executive Vice President and Chief Academic Officer there. So I've spent the last 25 plus years in academic administration with the land-grant university.
I'm Richard L. Fleming. I joined the university in 1956 as Assistant Extension Editor. Subsequent to that, I served as department head, head of the Department of Agriculture, or Publication, head of Department of Public Relations, and assistant to the Chancellor.
The Land-Grant University Act essentially had a very common purpose all across the United States and its various territories at the time. Although part of the genius, at least from my perspective, of the Land-Grant University Act is that it didn't overly prescribe. It is handwritten, as virtually, I guess, all the acts were in that time in history. It's only 3 pages long, and of those 3 pages, only a very few words. I have counted them before, but I'm ashamed to say that I've forgotten them. 200 words, something like that, are devoted to the educational part. The rest of it deals with how the land would be transferred to the various states. But the really redeeming quality in all of that act is it left the specifics up to the legislatures of the various states and territories. So they were all land-grant universities, but how the states and territories decided they would be set up, how they would interact with the people, that was pretty much left without much detail. And it turned out to be a very, very good thing. I want to be clear that while agriculture and natural resources and human sciences are extremely important, that's not what a land-grant university is all about. Justin Smith Morrill was absolutely clear that they had to have as their leading object the study of agriculture, the mechanic arts, which we would call engineering today, but that the classics could not be excluded. And if you can't have something excluded, that means it has to be included. So what Mr. Morrill had, a man that never went past the 5th grade because that was the circumstances of the time, what he had was an invention to keep on reinventing itself. And that's these land-grant institutions that we have today that allow creativity to be fostered, allow ideas to grow, to be challenged, to be discarded, to be expanded upon. The original vision and today are really all tied up in variations on the same theme. And I would argue that probably nothing was more important to the future of the nation back in 1862 than the establishment of a public investment, a public commitment to higher education. And I would argue also that nothing is more important today in 2012 than a public investment in higher education into the future of this country, into research or innovation or whatever it might be called, into true education and into maybe the most successful type of education out of the formal classroom ever devised, and that's the education delivered by our extension faculty member in every single county of this state for all practical purposes on any given day.
One of the things that's important for land-grant institutions like ours is to make sure that information that people in Nebraska can use is transmitted in a way they can understand and put to use themselves. One of the things that occurred soon after the turn of the century was some trains that went across the state with different stops by the Burlington Railroad. And they would spend a day in one community talking about one subject. I happened to be on the last train in the late 50s that focused on irrigation development. These were programs in which, in that case, we had an agronomist, crop specialist, an economics person, a person involved in insects, diseases, and other aspects, fertilization and so forth, to talk about how they could increase yields, and in this case, to utilize irrigation. And during that period, former President D.B. Varner felt that we could double our production and acres irrigated in a decade, and we almost did it. We went from about 4 million to about 7.5 million in that decade.
It affected education in the United States by being the first bona fide investment of money, of dollars, into public education. And that was just critically important, because before that it was all left up to the states and territories, and they grew in many, many different ways or didn't develop so well. But this signified that it was in the best interest, and I would argue, and I think most people would, that it still is today, it's in the best interest of the United States of America to make sure that there is an adequate, substantial investment in education on behalf of the public. There's plenty of room, and they play unbelievably important and critical roles for private institutions, but also it's just terribly important that the people, the citizens, the taxpayers of a state now make a true investment in the future of their states. And quite frankly, nothing is a better investment than education. So it was carried out quite elegantly with the goal of having an educated citizenry. And then, of course, the acts that you asked about a bit earlier, the Hatch Act brought in very active research into all of this mix. And then the Smith-Lever Act of 1914, which sort of legitimized something that had been ongoing in virtually every one of the land-grant universities, and that is extension, or cooperative extension at the time. You don't hear cooperative quite as much as you used to, but really all it meant, but it's a very important distinction, that there was a three-way investment, one from the federal government in extension, one from the state through the land-grant institution, and an investment from the various counties. And Nebraska is one of the states that's made sure that extension has stayed extremely viable in the counties, delivering critically important programs. We've got 93 counties in Nebraska. Through a couple of cooperative efforts, we have 83 bona fide offices. A handful of counties share a common office. But this institution has an impact every single day in the life of Nebraskans in every corner of the state. And one of those is through the 4-H program, an unbelievably successful educational program for young people. And Nebraska enjoys the reputation of having the highest per capita enrollment in 4-H of any state in the nation. And that says a lot about how important that educational program is. But in summary, how has Nebraska delivered and lived up to the basics of the Land-Grant University Act? I think in the most elegant way possible, by staying relevant to the people of the state, the taxpayers and the other citizens, as close to a daily basis as is possible.
I recall that many times it's being able to put science to work on the farm. And that's what these trains and other activities did. We also did a lot in radio, television. A good example of television right now is, of course, Backyard Farmer. That's aimed at the urban audience, but suburban audience too. Right. And Market Journal is another example. One of the things that we can do is to make sure the results of our research is transmitted to the people. And I really think of the university as being like a people's university. And when we get out a news release or a television program or radio program or whatever it might be, we are really serving our constituents. And in turn, they support us to do research and extension work as well as teaching. And so I think that, to me, we're just making the university available to them, the results we have, that they can apply for their own livelihood.
To me personally, the land-grant universities that I have been at, studied at, or worked at have helped me develop as a person. I have grown both personally and professionally through those associations, and I am just one tiny example of that. This type of education has a major impact on people worldwide, essentially, but with a concentration in the United States. One of the things I worked on throughout most of my professional career, the older I got, the more convinced I became that this Morrill Act and the things that followed at the subsequent institutions that were formed really did and do play a critical role in the lives of Americans. And so one of my goals was to just make sure we get reminded of that. I've had some colleagues and associates over the years that thought I reminded folks too often of the Land-Grant University Act, but I think you really have to know without any question whatsoever at an intuitive level, at a tissue level, what you're about. And by that I don't mean this time us personally, but what's this institution about? Why are we here? What makes it special? And it's tied to the historical perspective as well as to the future.
When universities were created in this country, we tended to model after German universities. Also was a lot of emphasis, even in this country, early universities, for people who were going into church work, ministers and so forth, and of course the basic professions like medicine. And so when the university here got started, they really had a different focus. And a lot of people were skeptical about a university and book learning until they could see what this would do. And we see it every day, and the different things, results that come out of our laboratories, shared with students, shared with the general public, shared with companies involved in agriculture. And so it's a payoff, a direct payoff back to the people for their dollars that they put in, both locally, statewide, and at the national level, to make this institution go. And we see it every day. We're going to see more of it very visually in the Innovation Campus, which you probably have heard about, which is the old fairgrounds. And we're going to see in a visual way some things happening that hopefully will be very beneficial not only to the people of Nebraska, but people worldwide. And that's a lot of our focus today.
I'm kind of proud that Extension is so successful here in Nebraska, and that on a per capita basis, one can construct a strong argument that we are the leading state for that. But there aren't enough Extension faculty member or any other faculty member to manage 132,000 people involved in 4-H, young people, and that's done by volunteers, people who don't receive a dime in their paycheck from the University of Nebraska, but receive something worth much, much more than that. And that's the satisfaction of seeing a young person begin to develop, continue to develop, to decide to go to college, to decide to do something else, but to have an impact on them. We've got over 10,000 unpaid volunteers everywhere across Nebraska that deliver the 4-H program. It's a remarkable statement on how important a land-grant institution can be. And that's emulated in essentially every state in the country. If Mr. Morrill were alive today, he would have a whole lot to feel really good about.